Okay, we're going to start covering material by discussing the importance of customers in digital marketing. So first, let's start with kind of an informal definition of what digital marketing is. At the end of the day, something that should not be a surprise given that you've already taken a marketing class where we've already touched on some of these aspects. Digital marketing is just marketing anyway. So the basic principles that we have discussed in Business 380 are gonna 100% apply to what we're gonna be discussing today, and today in any other chapters of this class. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna try to emphasize how basically the fact that we're using a digital media is going to change some of the rules substantively, things that we have oftentimes taken for granted in a brick and mortar environment are going to dramatically change when you go digital. So the key principles of marketing still apply. Marketing is still about value creation for customers by basically engaging with those customers and providing a product or a service that is of sufficient value for them to keep coming back to you, which is essentially the definition of marketing that we have given in 380. Now what we're going to do is we're going to see what happens when that exchange of value happens mediated by a digital environment. For the most part, it's going to be the internet. Whether you're accessing the internet in a computer, you're using a tablet, or you're using your smartphone, which is the most likely source at this point. And the rules in which you basically engage with firms, with brands, and with content are going to be different than in the real world, let's say, in the non-mediated world. And what that's going to do is it's going to change the way we as marketers engage with customers. So when I'm saying that the rules are different between digital and brick and mortar, what I'm trying to say is that you're moving from what would be traditional one way of communication where the firm, the brand, is the one that basically buys media and communicates almost single-handedly in one direction towards the consumer, where there is almost no feedback coming back, to now a two-way conversation between brands and customers. Now it's not just the brand that has a big megaphone and is blasting a message using advertising. Now users and customers have a say in the matter as well. Right? There are a lot of customers that have large followings, for example, in social media platforms, and because of that, you will end up engaging in conversations with them. So we go from a one-way model of communication to a two-way model of communication, where you're going to be having conversations. You're going to go from owned media, where you actually pay for your message to go out, to actually earned media, where if you want to be part of the conversation with customers, you actually need to do something valuable that they are actually interested, and they will actually listen and engage with you. Whereas before they have no other choice because you were the one paying for that communication. Another aspect also that is going to come with digital is that for the most part, you're going to be dealing with a global market. Now, it's interesting because the global nature of the internet does not change the fact that a lot of the aspects discussed in marketing are going to be local nonetheless. So there might be ways of isolating territories or geographies that are going to enable you to have different strategies in different locations. But for the most part, in general, you're moving from small local audience to the entire planet actually is potentially now your marketplace. And this is going to make some of the decisions interesting / different. Now, why would you want to do digital marketing? Well, I think the advantages are obvious given what I've just discussed, especially the global aspect. So it's going to give you access to a larger pool of demand. And because of that, you're going to be able to potentially, if you do a good job, reach more customers, engage with more customers, and because of that, get a larger return on your investment. Right? The other appealing aspect of the internet is that a lot of the media changes and improvements are relatively low cost. So it's going to give you an opportunity to engage customers in a pretty financially advantageous way, right? You're going to be able to reach a lot of people by not spending a lot of money, which obviously financially is a very attractive aspect. Another aspect of digital is that it enables you to change campaigns usually quicker than in all media, right? So if you're having an advertising campaign on TV, changing that might be a lot more not only cost prohibitive, but actually it might involve aspects that will require a long time. And because of that, making quick changes might actually be difficult. On the other hand, in a digital space, making a quick switch or making changes to a website, for example, might enable you to tweak your product and the customer experience by making changes that in the real environment will be almost cost prohibitively, or they will just take too long to actually do that. Finally, actually the last two aspects that I really want to highlight. One is that the internet, while global, it enables you to find these niche segments of customers that have very specific interest, right? So if you're interested in finding customers that, I don't know, let's say something silly, that collect, what could you collect that will be silly? That collect staplers, right? I bet you anything you can find some sort of community online that is interested on staplers, which is something that you will never be able to find in the real world because these people are geographically dispersed. It is very unusual that you will find a large portion of people in the same place at the same time that have this really bizarre, or let's just say more than bizarre, unique interest, right? On the other hand, the fact that you have such a large reach online enables you to actually find these people, and more amazingly from a marketing perspective, target them fairly efficiently so that you can actually sell to this niche group of customers. And finally, you can do all this by having a large amount of data at your disposal to see whether your efforts are actually happening appropriately or not. And this is going to enable you to close a loop that traditionally marketing has a hard time, which is seeing what the return on investment of your marketing assets are going to be. And the fact that you're online, it's going to give you more data available. And because of that, it tends to be easier to showcase whether things are actually working and to what extent online than in an offline environment, although there are challenges to both, as we will see later on. Now, even though you are in a digital space or maybe in a brick and mortar or a mixture of the two, which is what most firms are going to be facing, if you have taken your intro marketing class, I hope that by now what I'm going to say in this slide does not surprise you at all. It's all about your customer. Okay? If you need to make a decision, you should in general put the interest of the customer first, because that's the long-term winning strategy, right? What I'm trying to say with this is the ideal, whether it's online or offline, is for you to understand your customers so well that you can create some sort of product or service that is of unique value to the set of customers that you're targeting. Okay. Now this starts with defining who your customer is. You're going to have some sort of segmentation or persona analysis, as we're going to see in a few slides, where you're going to identify a unique group of customers that have unique preferences. And because of that, what you're trying to do is A, understand those preferences, and B, after you have understood those preferences, try to build some value that is unique for that segment, something that maybe you can do a better job than anybody else. So to get to that point, it is absolutely essential that you understand your customer. So what we're going to do in the next few slides is discuss a few tools that are going to help you in this endeavor so that we can understand better how and why customers are going to make decisions the way they make them. So before we get into the customer behavior piece, let's discuss quickly what are the three forces that really make the digital customer side of the equation different from the traditional customer behavior that we have discussed, for example, in 380 or 385, if you have taken that class, which is consumer behavior. First, the first aspect that makes digital unique is the fact that digital tends to disrupt the ecosystem. What does that mean? It really changes the way customers behave, right? So if you think, well, you guys are young, so maybe you don't see this so clearly, although you might see it if you compare to what your parents and maybe your grandparents do. But over the last 20 years, the way we consume, for example, our content has changed dramatically. So if you go back 20 or 25 years ago, the average American was spending about 4 hours a day watching TV. Right now, that number has decreased dramatically, where it's under an hour. But the average American also spends over 6 hours a day looking at their smartphone. So what has happened is not that people consume less content. Quite the contrary. In fact, they consume more, at least if you look at the number of hours spent consuming content. But what has happened is that consumption pattern has shifted dramatically. The way we actually consume content now is different than it used to be. Now content's available essentially at your disposal at all time because the average American has a smartphone with them pretty much at all times. And because of that, if you have, for example, a few minutes to kill because you're visiting your good old friends at the DMV because you need to, I don't know, get a new license plate. And what you're going to do while you're waiting is you're going to pull your smartphone and you're going to be doing something. You're going to be reading the news, you're going to be texting, you're going to be doing whatever you're doing, but that gives you a new opportunity to consume content, right, that you didn't have when content was consumed in other ways, right? Not only that, obviously the way we communicate has changed dramatically. Now, for example, it's all about texting if you're young, even though for other folks like me, maybe we prefer to, if we're going to talk to somebody, actually call them instead of texting them, right? How we relate to others altogether, right? If you're dating, maybe the way you will meet your significant other, whatever that means in your case, may actually be dating online, right? I suspect that's an overwhelming majority of people that actually do that, right? How we go about shopping, especially in the last 2 years after COVID. The amount of e-commerce has absolutely skyrocketed, and I don't think it's going back at this point, especially now that in every smartphone, right, you have your favorite app, let's say Amazon app, for example, right, that enables you to, at any point in time during the day, if you want to make a quick purchase, you can just go ahead and do so. It really lowers the bar of the cost associated with making a purchase, etc., etc., etc. Is that what I'm trying to say is digital media has 100% disrupted the way we actually interact with others, with information, the way we do our shopping, etc., etc. What else has changed for the digital consumer? Well, like I was mentioning before, now you're moving from a local market to a global market. But it's interesting because the locality and globality of the market are going to happen simultaneously. The internet is so flexible and powerful that it enables you to have specific campaigns for specific geographies or locations. So you can actually have different ad campaigns in different countries, right? So that, for example, if there are language or, more importantly, cultural barriers or differences, they don't have to be barriers per se, right? You will be able to reach them differently so that you can make sure that your message is targeting and it's really catering to the customer that you're able to reach. So it's both global and local simultaneously, right? And then finally, there is this idea of the attention economy, right? If you want to do it just for fun, I tend to do things like this. I like to go on long walks because, you know, I'm too old to run, I guess, or maybe too lazy. And because of that, what I do oftentimes is when I'm going for a long walk, I will see it at intersections, especially if I need to wait for my light to turn green. And I will watch people driving. And when you're paying attention, one thing that you will see overwhelmingly is that most people right now, they are driving and they have their smartphone on their hand, and only God knows what people are up to on their smartphones while they are driving, right? So this idea of the attention economy is that attention as a resource is actually scarce. There is only so many hours in the day. On Earth, it seems to be about 24 hours, right? And because of that, there is only so much attention that you can pay to different apps, to different websites, to different brands, to different people, right? So if you look at attention as a resource, then you're going to realize that a lot of these digital players, both brands, websites, and apps, they are actually vying and competing for your attention, right? So this idea of the eyeball economy, right? You can monetize it in multiple different ways. We'll talk about some of those as we go, but this is a very important aspect of all the digital marketing and consumer behavior. Now, I'm going to discuss briefly a couple of tools that you can use when you're thinking about, for example, your marketing plan, right? Tools that you can use to try to understand your customers. Okay. The first one is this idea of a persona. Now, in Business 380, we have talked at length about segmentation, at least as much as we're going to do at an undergrad level. Now, there is a qualitative tool, which is called a persona, that tends to help give some more granularity to this concept of a segment. So if you do have hard data and you can just create segments, or basically, better said, identify segments by maybe looking at some preference data or maybe some demographic data. I'm going to discuss some of that later. Or maybe some psychographics, right? Things like interests or activities that people do, right? You can use that to create segments, which are a group of homogeneous customers that have similar preferences. Now, when you come up with a segment, one thing that is very useful from a product design, for example, perspective, is having a persona associated with a segment. What is a persona? A persona is a much more granular description of who that segment is, or what would be a prototypical person from that segment. If you were to select one person at random from the segment, and you will give me a very granular description of who that person is, that essentially is a persona. Now, what a persona does, especially if you're designing a product, is it gives you a much more concrete idea of what the users will be interested in, and that's going to help you guide, for example, the new product design. They are going to help you decide, for example, what kind of features are necessary for that product to actually do well in the marketplace, because you can clearly relate to who that segment is. And that mediation between the segment, which is a very abstract and dry set of numbers, and your design process is going to be the persona. It's this rich description of who typical people in that customers will be. Now, when you're building that persona, on top of the granularity, you should also understand what the basic demographics of that persona is. And by the way, you could have multiple personas for the same segment, but typically you don't do that, because then it gets a little confusing. So what you will have is you will have at least one persona per segment, and I strongly suggest you have just one persona per segment, the person that will more typically characterize that segment. And you should have the demographics in there, right? So what is their gender, what is their age, what other demographics will be interesting? For example, income, right? That's going to help you. Maybe geographic location, right? What will you expect to find them, right? This could be a little bit nebulous. So it doesn't have to be, for example, that you discuss the zip code, but it might be maybe more interesting when you're talking about the persona to discuss whether they are somebody that lives in the suburbs or in the inner city or in a large city versus a small city, etc., etc. Something that will give us an idea that will help us characterize better this person, and ideally will enable us to build a better product or a better website that will enable us to reach these people, right? And the same thing with psychographics, right? What are psychographics? These are things like activities and interest, things that people like to do or are interested in or are afraid of, and because of that they are avoiding seriously, right? It could be the positive or the negative. So this would be, for example, things like, I don't know, let's say, for example, that part of your persona is somebody who is into extreme sports. Well, the kind of activities that they will engage in will be very different than somebody who is a couch potato, right? Which maybe is going to be less active, it's going to be interested in more traditional content, etc., etc., etc. So when you're building your persona, make sure that you are as much granularity and as much information as possible. That gives you a really clear idea. At the end of the day, you should feel like you know this person after you read this careful profile or persona description. What else should you understand about your customers? One of the most important aspects when it comes down to decision making, which is what we're interested in, because we want to know who is going to be willing and maybe able to buy our products or our services, is this idea of motivation, right? Essentially, what you're trying to address is, why do people buy the products they buy? Or why do people engage with the content that they engage? Or why do people play the games that they play or relate to the people? It's all about why. Okay. Now, you could have multiple motives, obviously, right? It doesn't have to be only one. But typically, there is a dominant motive that is the one that is going to be driving most of the decision making. And within motives, an important distinction is whether the motivators that the customer is using are extrinsic or intrinsic. Now, what is an extrinsic motivation? Extrinsic motivation is motivation that is outside of the customer. So in this case, if we're talking about a marketing decision, which will be, for example, a transaction like a purchase, or going to a website, it doesn't have to be just buying, it will be just clicking on a link, for example. An extrinsic motivation will be something that is outside of the customer, right? Typical example in marketing will be when you have a big discount sign, right? So if you put in a link that says get 50% off your next purchase, click here, right? That will be an extrinsic motivation. The reason why you're clicking in the link is because there is an offer that you're seeing. It's not because you're excited about the link per se, right? So that will be external to you. And other marketing motivators, other than the typical things like a discount or an offer, will be scarcity, right? If you let people know, for example, that, I don't know, let's say you're an airline, right? And you're trying to sell some seats at one of your flights. One thing that you can do is you can display the number of seats available at that price. So if you say only 2 seats available at this price, people are going to be more likely to click on that link, and maybe, if you're lucky, if your bounce rate is low, closing the transaction, if you generate this sense of scarcity by letting the customer know that once that those 2 seats are gone, the price is likely to go up, right? Okay. Another extrinsic motivation that you're going to see a lot in the marketplace is this idea of loyalty programs, right? So if you purchase, I don't know, speaking of plane tickets, if you have a loyalty card from Delta, for example, if you buy a flight at Delta, maybe that's going to enable you to upgrade to a business class in your next flight, and because of that, you may be more likely to buy that flight from Delta than you will from, let's say, American, right? It's not because necessarily you like Delta better, it's just that you happen to have, you happen to be part of the loyalty program, right? Okay. Now, the downside of extrinsic motivation is that usually a lot of these incentives drive the action because of the incentive itself. And what that tends to do is it tends to give you customers, or it tends to help you land customers that tend to be very deal prone and obviously motivated by extrinsic motivators, which is going to mean oftentimes customers that are less loyal and more willing to jump to alternate firms or brands, right? So it is a good way of, let's say, enhancing your marketing efforts, but you need to understand that there is a cost associated with extrinsic motivators like discounts, which is that you're going to be essentially self-selecting customers that tend to be more deal prone, and because of that, unless you provide a deal, these people may actually not be purchasing from you anymore, right? What is the alternative to extrinsic motivators? Intrinsic motivators. These are things that basically drive the action because the action itself is valuable for the customer. For example, some people enjoy certain products, right? And just the pure enjoyment of that product is what drives the purchase. It's not because it's not a deal, they will have bought it either way. It's because, like in my case, if I'm going to have some sweet, for example, I'm going to be having Nutella because I really enjoy the flavor of that brand. I've tried other hazelnut spreads, but nothing comes close to Nutella, at least for my personal enjoyment. So in a situation like that, regardless of whether Nutella is in a discount or not, I'm going to purchase it anyway. It's the enjoyment that is driving the response. Another important aspect, because we are all social creatures, is this idea of self-expression, right? You may be buying a certain brand because you're trying to tell a story about yourself to others, especially if it's a product that it's going to be publicly consumed. Like, let's say, for example, the shirt that you're wearing, right? I mean, if it's a Nike shirt, maybe you're trying to tell a story about you to others, right? About values associated with that brand, about things that you like, that you think other people should know about you, about maybe a cause that you are actually trying to push forward, right? So those values that you have, you might be able to convey to others without having to interact with them by just displaying some brands that are consistent with the values that you're interested in. So this idea of self-expression and values may be tightly associated with them, right? And finally, one note to mention is that for every positive motivator that I'm mentioning here, there is usually a shadow or negative motivator associated with it, and those oftentimes have stronger effects on our decisions than the positive ones, as we're going to see in the next presentation. So, for example, fear of missing out, right? If you are telling me that something is scarce, it could be the fact that I'm worried about missing out on something that will be driving my action, right? So, for example, if I have fear of missing out, I might be logging into my favorite video game to make sure that that special item that I can acquire today but not tomorrow, I'm going to be able to obtain. Is that fear of missing out? Interestingly, as we will see, these negative effects tend to be weighted more heavily by our brain than the positive ones, although they create some fatigue and tiredness in customers. So it's unclear whether long-term is a preferred strategy over positive. But both positive and negative intrinsic motivators have the upside that they are not necessarily going to get you people that are deal prone. The downside is that creating those values might actually be made a lot harder than just getting a discount. So creating intrinsic motivators that are associated with the brand may be hard in a long-term successful strategy. On the other hand, a lot of these extrinsic motivators, they tend to be much more short-term oriented, and they may be in conflict with some of the intrinsic motivators that you're trying to create. So balancing these two types of motivations around a brand might actually be a challenging but maybe rewarding thing to do in the long term. And then finally, for this presentation, I want to mention another tool that you can use. This idea of spending a life in the day of your customer. This is a very, very powerful market research tool that you can use. And now, the difficulty is that you need to find a customer that is willing to let you spend time with them and ask them maybe some questions or observe, or maybe a combination of both. But once that you manage this, spending times with the customer enables you oftentimes to see things that were a lot harder to see, because the way we all humans make decisions and envision things is from our own perspective. So this idea that for you to spend a day in the life of your customers, you first need to remove your preconceptions about how things are. What do you mean by that, Professor? Well, let me give you an example. Right now, you are in a group of people that on average, because you are in college at a private institution, on average, the IQ of your classmates is around 110, right? What that means is if you use people in your class as a frame of reference, which we all do because we are human, right? It is very hard for us to understand how people make decisions where their IQ, for example, is a lot lower, right? And there are people in society, if you look at normal distribution of IQ, about 20% of, I don't know, it's 20%, let's say between 15 and 20% of the population have an IQ below 90, right? Now, an IQ below 90 means that these people have a really hard time making decisions if there is any logic involved, right? So these are people that have a hard time, for example, budgeting, getting a list of items before you go, for example, grocery shopping, etc., etc., etc. So the way they're going to go about making decisions is completely different the way you envision, right? And you need to understand that just because you don't have a lot of people in your frame of reference that are similar to this, that doesn't mean that 20% potentially of your customer base will not go about making decisions very differently, right? So for you to spend time with some of these segments that are inherently different from you, it's going to really illuminate and it's going to really pinpoint a difference that is going to enable you to create offerings that are going to satisfy needs that maybe you don't have, right? So this idea that before you basically get into somebody's shoes, you need to take your own. By the way, this is a quote that I first heard from the CEO of Intuit about 15 years ago, right? And he's right. He also mentioned that he's never gotten any substantive insight from quantitative information, but every insight that he has seen within his 20 plus years of experience doing this is been from qualitative information. Quantitative is important to test whether those insights are real or not. So the idea of spending a day in the life of your customer is basically try to understand how they go about making the purchases, right, that you're interested in. Like, for example, one thing that I've done when I was working with a company that makes snacks, for example, is I contacted customers within their target segment, and then we went grocery shopping with them. I say we because we were always working in pairs, always with the consent of the customer, and we will basically shadow them. And then at the end of the trip, we will ask a few open-ended questions to make sure that we understand what it is that they did, pointing out some of the behaviors that we saw, and maybe try to understand the whys, right? And this gave us a very clear picture of how these type of customers, for example, went about buying groceries, which is what we were interested at the time. And then that enabled us to build new products, new packages, and new communication strategies so that we could actually better satisfy